Reddit, have you ever had a close encounter with a well-known criminal serial killer? I went to Virginia Tech and had class with Sung Hui Cho. On the first day he introduced himself as from Planet X. He didn't speak the rest of the year. When the professor asked him to read a passage aloud, he walked out and didn't come back for a few days. He started stalking one of the girls in the class until she called the police. This was about a year before the massacre. From Planet X. Sounds like he unsuccessfully auditioned to be the backup drummer for The Roots. When I was 15, I was cast in a musical about an hour away from my hometown. My mom didn't want to drive me, but a couple people in the musical could see how important it was to young, teenage, I'm going to be an actress me, so they offered to drive me to and from the daily rehearsals all summer. I spent hours with this one guy. He was normal, nice enough, constantly hit on me, but whatever. Last year he was all over the local news for physically shaming his neighbor, and then chopping her and her boyfriend up and burying their bodies in a local park. The weirdest part was only 2 or 3 days before the murders I ran into him at a bar. We exchanged numbers and planned to hang out in the near future. Dodge that bullet. If you can dodge a psychopath, you can dodge a ball. About 5 years ago when I worked in Chiapas, Mexico, I used to go to a country club with my brother to get some lessons and play a little tennis. There we met an American by the name of Charlie that was there every morning with his wife and young kids. He was a volunteer instructor there, so we played with him and talked to him and his wife a couple times. I even played with his kids, a boy of about 3 that already could return the ball and play some slow points and a girl of about 6 that was already winning some kids tournaments. Suddenly he stopped going to play and no one knew why. He just disappeared. A week later we found out that one of his neighbors found the bodies of his wife and kids inside their house when he smelled the decay from his house. Turned out that they had been dead for a week and Charlie was missing, apparently on the run. They found his body a month later in a room of a little hotel in Guatemala, where he killed himself. He was an ex-cop from Alaska wanted for the murder of a woman in Las Vegas, and he escaped to Guadalajara. There he met his wife, whose family later reported as kidnapped. Seems like they just moved to Chiapas and started living there. To me he just seemed like a good guy with a happy little family that enjoyed to play tennis, so that was pretty shocking. To me he just seemed like a good guy with a happy little family that enjoyed to play tennis. But the whole thing was a racket. My friend got a chemical burn at work and went to the hospital. While he was there he held the door open for an Asian man covered in blood being escorted by the police. The next morning he read about the Tim McLean beheading on that bus outside the town we live in. So he figures he held the door open for Vinsley hours after he just killed and partially ate a guy. That has to be one of the most horrific and disturbing murders I read about. Not really a close encounter, but my grandmother was murdered by Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole. There isn't really just a whole lot to the story. My grandmother and her husband, not my grandfather, owned a book liquor store in Austin back during the late 70s. Toole and Lucas just happened to be driving by, got out of their car, walked in and shot my grandmother in the face 3 times, and then turned it on her husband. They never actually caught Lucas and Toole. The two sat across the interstate drinking beer and watching the sheriff's department conduct their investigation. It was only years later, when the building had been changed into a bank, I believe, and Lucas was being transported in a squad car that drove by the place, that he said, "Me and Otis killed a man and a woman in that building." My father, who is now a hotshot attorney, was a cop for years, and he even agreed that they knew far too much about the case and about what happened inside that was never released. So, yeah, kind of crazy. This was back in October of '79, so I wasn't even born yet. I'd call that a pretty close encounter. March of 2011, a fairly good friend of mine lost his mind and murdered his twin brother and mother and father with a samurai sword and knives in the suburbs of Philadelphia. When the cops showed up, he was sitting in his driveway, covered in blood, and when they asked what happened, he replied only, "Extermination." He then referred to his family members as person called brother and person called father, etc. I also think he was in love with me. Holy crap. This was only a few months ago. I'd love to hear more about your friendship with the dude. Yes, I worked at this nice, clean and regular sized cyber cafe. My work was about assigning computers to costumers, charging them by the hour and a lot of chatting. LOL. My boss always told me that we always had to make the costumer feel like in home, and we even memorized some of the costumers' names to greet them as they walked in. This particular costumer was a very polite guy, who always said good afternoon when walking in, always at 6 PM, and thank you when leaving. Having been checking email for 15 exact minutes, no more or less, he always paid in exact cash. No big bills and no hassles, just straight to the point. Her hair was always cut in a military way, brush cut, and he didn't talk much. He seemed like another costumer to me. One day, two very big guys walked in, carrying big .45 pistols, and as we don't see much guns in southern Mexico, I got scared as crap. They started to pop some rude questions and all I did was to babble some noises. Then this much smaller, mustache guy entered and said, "Okay, let me do this to me in a dominant way. Like a dog trainer telling his beasts to retreat. LOL. He then asked me in a friendly way if I was able to help them to identify some criminal out there. I didn't have a choice, so I got out the cafe and saw two big vans and two heavy armored federal police trucks out there. The little boss then ordered to open one of the van's doors and I saw my polite client surrounded by the scary, tall and muscly looking guys. At this point I felt bad for my client. Here in Mexico the police usually pick a random guy at the streets and accuse him for anything they need, so they have someone to show to the press. So I decided to help my costumer and said, "I know this man. He's a loyal costumer and a good person who always checks his email with us." He not even blinked and asked me about his tennis shoes. "Do you remember what tennis he used to wear?" Stupid question. So I asked, raising my eyebrow, because we used to have a lot of costumers. The feds then walked me to my spot at the cafe and told me do not leave the town soon and partied with police horns and all that crap. Next day, my boss is waiting for me with eyes wide open and pale as a ghost. After I referred my story he slowly gave me the newspaper which read "Serial Killer Captured at Last" with a picture of my polite costumer. In his declaratory statement he said that Satan made him to stalk elderly women and then to break in their houses. And then, after beating the crap out of them, he robbed their money and jewelry, only to shoot them in the stomach and cutting their throats and some sick crap. He was captured because some grandma survived and gave the police a detailed description and cooperated in a police sketch. So, yes, I tried to help a serial killer to get out of a federal car. Phew, I was so naive at the time. Sorry, English is not my mother lang. I always feel bad when people apologize for speaking poor English. I took 4 years of language classes. I can count to 20 and say hi in Spanish. Not famous necessarily, but at my old job we had a huge turnover rate. As a consequence we'd hire dang near anyone who had a pulse and could read. One day someone starts there that looks like he'd literally just walked off the prison bus before he got to the office. I've seen much worse before, so I don't give him a second thought until he's seated right next to me. As it turns out, he's actually a reasonably nice person trying to turn his life around. We teach him the business and while he's a slow learner, he puts a great effort into it and ultimately becomes quite successful. He hits a huge level in sales and goes out that Saturday to celebrate. He gets in a fight with some gangbanger and it escalates until my co-worker takes out a switchblade and knifes the guy dead. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life. Still bums me out to think about it because he was 23 at the time. I understand he killed someone, but I think in that act he destroyed his own life as well. My high school math teacher went to high school with Ted Bundy. I grew up in Washington state, so there are a few tangential connections like that in my life. The PAC-NW is full of serial killers. My dad told me this story. One time he was dating this girl and she wanted him to come and meet her family. So they drive into the middle of nowhere. She gets out of the car and says, "1 minute." Some random guy comes out of the woods and starts to roll around on the hood of his car. Takes a cigarette and then eats it. He throws that crap in reverse and bails. Turns out she meant the Manson family. The guy wasn't a serial killer per se, but a murderer nonetheless. About 8 years ago, I was in 4th grade. There was a new kid at school who had been homeschooled up until this point. I'll call him Steve. Come to find out that this guy lived about 3 houses down from me, just outside of the circle of people I knew. We became decent friends. I hung out at his house. He hung out at mine. I thought his parents were kinda strange, but I never told him that. After 4th grade ended, his parents decided to start homeschooling him again because his mom had her 3rd kid on the way. I thought we could be friends still, but his stepdad decided to build a 9-foot fence around their entire property. Fast forward to about 3 years ago, I noticed that his stepdad has built another ring of fencing on the inside of the old one, and added some buildings and an awesome looking playground in the back. We start calling it the Steve compound. About a year and a half ago, I noticed his stepdad had started raising emus in their yard in North Carolina. Fast forward again to about a year or so ago, I heard gunshots in the middle of the night, about 1 AM. 3 of them. Steve's stepdad had come out of the back buildings of the compound where he had been sleeping because he and Steve's mom were estranged. Drunk. He killed Steve's mom, Steve, and then himself. Steve was 15 years old at the time. His sisters, who I believe were 7 and 9, and his grandmother got out unharmed. TLDR. In 4th grade I befriended a kid who was later murdered by his stepfather. Holy crap. I live a block away from Willie Pickton's old pig farm in Port Coquitlam, BC. I remember coming home from school with helicopters flying all over the place, my family watching the news that night and thinking holy frick. Apparently, the elementary school and most of the houses in this area are built on former Pickton land. Nothing serial, but I got swimming lessons from a man who, 2 years later, was convicted of manslaughter. He drove his friend's girlfriend to a house where the friend killed his girlfriend with a shotgun and then used it to kill himself. My ex-swimming teacher was convicted for bringing her to the house knowing what the friend was planning. My grandfather worked with Charlie Brandt, serial killer. He didn't know it at the time, and then a couple years ago 48 Hours did an episode on him and my grandpa realized who he actually worked with. I was on campus at Virginia Tech on the 16th of April, 2007, 2 buildings over, McBride, for the Hokies. I left my early class with my professor, talking, and went back inside when we heard gunshots and saw people running. We sat in MCB 136 for 3 hours, desks barricading the door, etc., watching everything on CNN. Eerie to see the building you're in on national news. Not good. We had no idea if it was one attacker, or an activation of a cell of attackers. I even entertained the idea that someone in every classroom would activate and shoot everyone. We were all looking at each other suspiciously. When the police came to evacuate us, they knocked on the door and said open up. Police, and we were like frick that. Slide us a badge. I remember after they slid us a badge under the door we asked them to slide us a second badge. They did. Then we opened the door and ran like frick to the parking lot. I had a full-size pickup truck, and the police said if you live on campus, go home with somebody in your class. Nobody's allowed on campus. So I got a little truckload of classmates and was dropping them off all over the dang place. When we were running from McBride to the commuter lot, I remember we had not been told if it was over or not. I asked a police officer if the killer killing was over with, and he said just run fast. I was thinking there was attackers on rooftops, shooting students. We did not know it was inside classrooms at the time. I remember thinking if I'm ever going to get a bullet in my brain, it's going to be in the next 30 seconds. It impresses me you had the presence of mind to ask for a badge. I would have just opened the door. Depending on your opinion, political views, this could count as a serial killer story. My neighbor committed suicide with Jack Kevorkian's assistance. I'm glad she did. She had a brutal form of cancer, according to the reports that leaked after. I think he was a stand-up guy who only meant to ease people's suffering. He was also not convicted for killing more than one person. My best friend from high school was down on her luck. She had cheated on her husband with Mark Mayland. Because of the affair she lost her kid and needed a place to stay. I invited her and the new boyfriend to stay with me. I found out they were on crack and kicked them out. A few weeks later he beat his dealer to death and hid him in the crawl space under the house they were staying at. She later told me that he did it while she was in the house and could hear the guy moaning under the house while he died. Suru glad that crap is out of my life. Not me, but a friend of mine was working at the sheriff's department in Eureka, Northern California, when a man came into the main desk, asked to be arrested and confessed to being a serial killer. Then he put a woman's severed breast on the desk as proof. My dad was childhood friends with the grandson of one of Ed Gein's last victims. They found this kid's grandmother's navel in a sewing basket. I slept with this guy a couple of times over the course of a few weeks. 2 years later, I see his photo on a bulletin board in a sandwich shop on a flyer saying he's a diddler and violates random women in the neighborhood. Boy, did I feel special. That's the closest thing I've got to relativity. Of all these posts, I found yours the most interesting. My stepmom used to couple with the Green River Killer. This was about 30 years ago. They worked together and both lived in Federal Way, Washington State. I remember when they caught him, she was kind of dumbfounded. My great-grandfather was a sheriff here in Texas. He got word Bonnie and Clyde would be passing through the area. He quickly rounded up some backup and attempted to head them off. They were too late though. Missed them by minutes apparently. He used to tell that story and then say that was the luckiest day of his life, because if he would have caught up with them they probably would have killed him. Not me, but my dad and his brother were supposed to go hang out with this guy my uncle met named John Wayne Gacy, clown killer in Des Plaines, ill. My great-grandpa was next door neighbors with Jack Ruby, the guy who killed JFK. After Oswald was killed, my great-grandpa was the only one keeping the media firestorm from breaking into Ruby's apartment. Also, my great-grandpa saw a man practicing his shot at a shooting range a week earlier. He later realized it was Oswald using the same gun that would take the president's life. I got gas a few minutes before the Beltway sniper killed someone at the Exxon I was at. I didn't know about it until I got to work. Everyone was freaking out worrying it was me. Seems weird everyone knew you went to that Exxon right before work that day. Fred West did my aunt start texting. No joke. He was known as a handyman in Glasgow and he also owned an ice cream van and he told her all about working in the van and stuff and she remembered he had a strange accent. He's from the Midlands, I believe, and they're in Glasgow. My cousin has the joke that he is a victim of Fred West because when he rolls over in his bed and his hand scrapes off of the texting, Fred West did that to him, haha. My best friend had a bad habit of fulfilling her teenage insecurities in high school by dating random weirdos off the internet. They ranged from awkward shut-in to this guy, Rex. She usually had the good sense to have a couple of us hang out at the food court while she entertained these dudes and thankfully we came to the rescue on her date with Rex. By the time we came to her rescue, he had her cornered in the DVD section at Borders, trying to shove his tongue down her throat. Even when broke it up and made up some story about her mom sending us to come pick her up because her aunt was in the hospital, he wouldn't give it up. He kept on trying to get handsy and make out with her as he followed us to our vehicle. A year or so ago, same friend and I are in our crime class working on our semester project. We had to find a big case going on in the county, go to the trials and write an analysis of the forensic evidence. Our homicide detective professor was very much into the case of some dude who met a young girl with several mental disabilities on the internet, took her on a date, then took her into the mountains to debauch and murder her. I took another case, but my friend was instantly drawn to this one. She tried to go to the trial for her project, but work or school always prevented her from going. We were talking about it a while ago and she decides to see what happened. The mugshots of the dude look eerily familiar. Turns out it was the creeper from Borders and we collectively crap out pants. He tried to plead not guilty by reason of insanity because velociraptors made him do it. Having met him briefly, I could see that. Not well known outside my hometown, but a guy who asked me out in high school, and whom I turned down, recently murdered his ex-girlfriend and her current boyfriend in the break room of the grocery store where they worked. He drove back to his dorm room, then killed himself when the cops arrived. I feel really bad because, upon hearing the news, my first two thoughts were, 1. Holy frick, am I glad I didn't date him. 2. I always thought he was an butthole. No one famous, I guess, but I grew up in a really small, close-knit neighborhood where everyone's kids played together, with the exception of one boy who was always dodging the crowd and getting into trouble. When I was in high school, news broke that he had stalked and killed his pregnant girlfriend. I still see his mom sometimes, and it's kind of odd to skirt the subject. A friend worked at a reform school and had to deal with Charles Manson age 9 or 10. Said nothing he could later do would surprise him. Check out my family's story with a Manson run-in. I've met the Craigslist killer a few times. He's from Verona, NY, and I went to an alternative school that housed dropouts and people with mental problems around the county, including Rome, VVS, Vernon, Verona, Sherrill, Camden and a few others. Well, one of the kids I hung out with then knew him and we got high a few times. Seemed pretty normal and was shocked when I heard about it. Heck, I'm from Oneida. I've racked my brain to try and remember if I met him too, but I honestly don't think so. When I was younger, maybe 9 or 10, we used to hang out with kids in the surrounding neighborhoods. One day, at an acquaintance's, barely knew the kid. His older brother was there with a couple older kids, maybe 13 or 14 years old. Not sure how we got separated, but before I knew it I was alone in a bedroom with one of the older kids, and he pinned me on the floor. We were all pretty into wrestling at the time, so I didn't think this was entirely strange. That is, until he had his hands over my mouth and nose and instructed me not to scream. I started to panic. I was small for my age, plus the age weight difference made it an unfair fight, and thankfully another kid wandered in at that moment and the guy got off me. He laughed and said we were just kidding around. A few years later, hadn't seen the guy since. When I was in middle school and he was in HS, he lured a young kid selling candy into his house, debauched him, strangled him to death, and hid the body in a suitcase in the woods behind his house. It took me years to realize they were the same person. I guess I must have repressed it or something. I used to be good friends and play soccer with Amanda, Knox's sister. I'm pretty sure Amanda was at one of our games but IDK. I don't really believe she actually did it though, so in my opinion she's not really a criminal. I agree. I think she is innocent. I was commenting to a female friend of mine that our neighborhood was safe. Turned on the news and there was a story about a diddler debaucher abducting, violating, and then murdering a girl in the field not 100 feet from our place the night before. It was one of those movie moments where I said it, flipped on the news and that came on. I believe I said, oh well, that's not helping my case at all. Growing up I was friends with two brothers who lived the next block over from us. I was pretty young but I remembered them having a dad and then I remember their dad not being around. They also were out of the neighborhood for a while but not for too long. Years later my mom told me that their dad was abusive and out of control. Their mom moved herself and the boys in with her best friend while she tried to end the relationship. One day the dad went over to the best friend's house and killed the best friend in an attempt to get at their mom. We were all pretty young when it happened, so I don't remember how they reacted to the whole thing and I clearly had no idea what had happened until later. Growing up in isolate northern communities leads to some seriously twisted things. In 2006 a guy who lived in the bush, that we had encountered a few times when we were hiking, was reported a number of times for animal abuse because he had something like 75 dogs and people didn't think he was treating them properly. Bylaw finally got involved and decided to head out to his place to take the dogs. It took them a bit to get there. He is a ways from town, and somehow he heard that they were coming. The guy shot all of his dogs and when the authorities arrived he was sitting on the pile of carcasses. He felt that if he couldn't have and abuse his dogs, nobody could, and then he had the nerve to try to sue the people that reported his abuses for libel and slander. I once worked as a counselor at a state penitentiary, so I've met several serial killers and a lot of murderers. As most people have noted, under low stress and in conventional non-threatening environments, they are behaved like anyone else. I've known some really nice guys that were doing time for murder. Serial killers are very different from run-of-the-mill murderers. The few I've known seem to have a distinctive undercurrent of crazy. The only prisoner that ever threatened to kill me was a serial killer serving men multiple life sentences. I worked in a rehab and the guy I was counseling once killed 7 men in one night. He was messed up. He's not really well known but a killer nonetheless. Not a serial killer, but when I was 11 years old I was close friends with a kid who lived a couple houses away from me. We would spend the night at each other's once in a while even. One night, his mother killed him. I was supposed to sleep over that night but my parents wouldn't let me. Not me, but a teacher of mine. In the late 70s she had started a local community theater. At the time, the box office was a small outbuilding set a little ways away from the theater, both buildings in a residential, but heavily wooded area. She was working the box office one evening and went to the main building to check on the progress of rehearsals. Things started to wrap up and she needed to lock up to leave. She realized that she left her keys in the box office, so she went back through the wooded area to get them. When she got into the box office, her keys were nowhere to be found. After looking around extensively and still not finding them, she had one of the other staff people lock up, and she called her husband to come get her. A few days later, Ted Bundy was captured just a few miles away, and one of the things he had with him were her keys. When I was fairly young, my dad sold a gun to some guy. Not illegally, he just sold random stuff he got from auctions. A while later he was contacted by the FBI or something because that guy ended up being a murderer. I never learned all the details because I was never really that close to my dad, but seeing these stories is making me want to call him now. Hey dad, want a bond? I want some internet karma. I grew up next to the mom of Gary Lawers, the kid who was killed in Northport by Ricky Casso over drugs, possible satanic worship, etc. She was one of the nicest people I knew but died about 5 years ago from cancer. When I was a kid, my dad saw Cary Stayner when we were visiting Yosemite. Cary Stayner is a serial killer in the area who beheaded 4 women and is currently on death row. I think he was working at the campsite that we were staying at the time. My dad only found out that he was a killer after he read about him being arrested later that year. He said that when he saw him he felt really uneasy about being around him. He said that it's one of the few times in his life that he has met someone who just seemed like they had a screw loose. Also, one of his patients was the victim of a murder in San Diego. It was really big news in San Diego at the time, and they had a lot of people looking for her. When they found her, they came to his office for her dental records so they could identify her. My mom's boyfriend lived next door to a couple that was murdered by their schizophrenic son. He chopped them into pieces and burned their bodies. My mom was over at her boyfriend's house the night they were murdered and she remembers smelling something burning. She said that it smelled strange and that it smelled like something was burning, but it wasn't the normal smell of wood burning or something like that. The schizophrenic guy that murdered his parents also slashed a bunch of people's tires, including my mom's, in the neighborhood a few weeks before the murder. Not my story, but my friend's aunt went on a date with Ted Bundy back in the day. She said he was really handsome and charming, and was actually pretty disappointed he didn't call her afterwards. Not me, but a dude they brought into my English class in 10th grade. He was a lawyer that for some time worked at the World Criminal Court. On his first day, he walks into a courtroom to watch a trial, and sitting on the stand is some African leader, the man who chopped off limbs and enslaved people to mine for diamonds. Now as soon as the lawyer walks in, the African leader switches from French to English. But because this leader went to college in the NY, he has this Brooklyn accent. So now, this mass murdering war criminal is describing the slaughters of hundreds of people in this Brooklyn accent. Pretty soon, the judge asked him why he's speaking at English. He then nods his head like the lawyer, and says for the American. I quote the movie Snatch, "Bricktop, and when you got your 6 pieces, you gotta get rid of them, because it's no good leaving it in the deep freeze for your mum to discover. Now is it? Then I hear the best thing to do is feed them to pigs. You got to starve the pigs for a few days, then the sight of a chopped up body will look like curry to a pisshead. You gotta shave the heads of your victims, and pull the teeth out for the sake of the piggy's digestion. You could do this afterwards, of course, but you don't want to go sieving through pig crap. Now do you? They will go through bone like butter. You need at least 16 pigs to finish the job in one sitting. So be wary of any man who keeps a pig farm. They will go through a body that weighs 200 pounds in about 8 minutes. That means that a single pig can consume 2 pounds of uncooked flesh every minute. Hence the expression, as greedy as a pig. Whoa, that's really creepy. I'm in Manitoba and it was all over the news here. I remember I was younger and my parents wouldn't let me watch the news about it because of how sick it was. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.